Welcome to Betrayal Recovery Radio, the official podcast of APSATS, the Association of Partners of Sex Addict Trauma Specialists, hosted by Dr. Jake Porter. APSATS is a nonprofit organization providing professional training and compassionate support to partners affected by problematic sexual behavior and betrayal trauma. In each episode, Dr. Jake guides a conversation of enlightening insights and practical tools to empower those affected by sex addiction and betrayal trauma to use their voices and live their values. The mission of Betrayal Recovery Radio is to offer hope to those in need of healing and growth to those moving through grief. And now, here's your host, Dr. Jake Porter.
Welcome to Betrayal Recovery Radio. I am your host, Dr. Jake Porter, and I am so happy to be back with you after a much longer than intended hiatus. And I'm really excited for this first conversation that I get to share with you as we launch this new season in Betrayal Recovery Radio. It's amazing to me the advances that have come about just in the last few years in terms of understanding the connection between many of our mental health and psychological challenges that we face and the very physical nature of the human life, including issues around gut health and body and nutrition and the functioning of our brain. And today I have an expert in that field, Laura Childers, who's a certified clinical partner consultant with APSATS, who is going to share a conversation with us. We're going to talk about the work that she does with betrayed partners, with sex addicts and chronic betrayers, with them individually and together as a couple, as she utilizes much of this new technology. Laura is the founder of Houston Neuro Solutions. She earned her licensed professional counselor designation in Texas in 1994 and discovered brain mapping and neurofeedback in 2014, which then inspired her to pursue advanced studies in the field. Laura's practice integrates advanced technology, neuroscience, and psychotherapy, focusing on nervous system health. She assists clients with various challenges, including toxic relationships, addictions, PTSD, ADHD, depression, learning disabilities, and much, much more. Laura is committed to finding the root cause of her clients' struggles. Many of her clients have been to numerous doctors and clinicians, but struggle to move to the level of thriving beyond merely surviving. Her assessment process allows her to consider medical, neurological, sleep, and psychiatric and psychological issues, leading to a more specific and effective set of referrals. By examining brain function, clients often gain a new sense of hope and clarity. They appreciate the insight from their assessments and are excited to embark on a journey of discovery where they're seen as experts in their own lives. Laura provides her expertise and training to help them find clarity, direction, and healing. And she's committed to staying at the forefront of neurotherapy, and she continuously pursues advanced education and mentoring in emerging technologies. She and I have shared several clients. She used to be on my team here at Daring Ventures before starting Houston Neuro Solutions on her own. And we continue to work together and collaborate together on many different clients. So she's amazing. You're going to be so impressed with the work she does. It's incredibly hope-giving. And so you're going to want to hang on for that conversation. Before we jump there, though, I do just want to say the Association of Partners of Sex Addict Trauma Professionals has many exciting things coming up. That are going to be something you want to look into, especially if you work in this field. On November the 1st, Kat Etherington is going to be presenting a presentation, The Psychology of Victim Blame and Self-Blame in Betrayal Situations. Kat is a wonderful, gifted teacher, one of my favorite people to listen to. So you can go to apsats.org to tune in and find out more about how to register for that. And then November the 5th through the 8th will be this year's multidimensional partner trauma model training live via Zoom. That is the cornerstone training of APSATS. And if you do want to work with this population, with people who have been betrayed, I cannot recommend another training more highly. All right, with that all announced, I just really am excited to let you listen in on my conversation with Laura Childers. Welcome to another episode of Betrayal Recovery Radio. I am so happy to have Laura Childers here with me. How are you, Laura? Thank you for joining me, my friend.
I'm doing great today. Thank you for asking me, my friend.
Yes, and it's just a joy to get to spend some time with Laura. Laura was on our team at Daring Ventures for a while and has now gone out on her own and is doing wonderful, incredible work in her practice, which toward the end we'll let you talk a little bit about that and share with folks what you're doing. But I said in my intro that I wanted to do this episode because you shared with me a presentation that you gave about empathy and the brain and the work you do as a neurotherapist. And I just want to jump right in to the topic here. You said in your presentation that humans are social creatures. Can you explain what you meant by that as an expert in the brain?
Yeah, absolutely. We have so many areas of the brain that focus on our ability to understand intentions, to emotionally understand facial expressions and tones of voices, and to resonate with one another in terms of having an intuitive sense of kind of each other. That's when we're really good, and it's subtleties and social emotional communication. Some people are better than others at that. And so some of the parts of the brain that are important are the medial prefrontal cortex, and that's associated with understanding mental states of
Mm,
others, which is important because if someone's mad, you kind of want to understand that. When they're happy, you
right.
want to understand that, right? It creates a meta representation of ourself and others, so that we
Yeah.
can understand where we're at and who we are in our social situations. And we have the amygdala, which kind of hooks over to this right frontal lobe, and that helps us with emotional comprehension. And and it really relies, it's part of our visual stream, so it relies on facial expressions and tones of voices. And if it's heightened, like it's hypervigilant, then it will look at facial expressions and tones of voices with a glasses of danger as opposed to safety. And so that will be our set point, is danger.
Mm,
Um, and then there's the temporal parietal junction, and that's involved in perspective taking and understanding of others' beliefs, which is more cognitive empathy as opposed to emotional.
okay.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
emotional empathy is going to be more that amygdala, that right temporal lobe. And then there's the anterior singulate, which is linked to emotional processing and social interactions. And so the anterior cingulate, if it's off, our emotions can be dysregulated, and it's much harder to connect socially if our emotions are dysregulated. If it's on, we kind of feel like we're in the flow. If the anterior cingulate
Hmm.
is in a good space, we feel like we're in the flow, and it's easy to relate, much easier to relate in that state.
Yeah.
So we also have one other area over the sensory motor cortex that is where our mirror neurons are stored. And so that's where we start as babies. And,
Mm,
we understand your mom, is holding you and looking at you and smiling, and you smile back. And so this is how we learn to socialize as babies every day and every step of the way. And sometimes when there's developmental trauma, this area um, can get dysregulated. It can also get dysregulated just genetically with certain
okay.
conditions.
Yeah.
And then if there's some fast stuff over that area, you can be hypervigilant in terms of kind of that whole walking on eggshells thing, that your
Wow.
senses are just extra hypervigilant, and with a danger filter on it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so our brain is wired for social, but it's also wired to protect us in
Yeah.
potentially dangerous social situation.
Yeah. So I'm gonna be, try to use my good therapist expert skills here and reflect that back to you. Make sure I heard you right. So basically, there's our brain. Could you say it's really like a collection of several different systems that are all working together, hopefully, to do their jobs, and so there are lots of different parts of the brain that need to come together, working optimally in order to do this connection thing as humans that is really deeply wired into who we are and what we need.
Absolutely. There's even a place called the Brunius, which is really autobiographical. It's our story. And in betrayal trauma, what happens to the story is it kind of gets exploded, and the truth in
Yeah.
that area gets exploded because it's built on the episodes of our life. And what the brain does is it lets us know where we are in relation to others, right?
Yeah.
Not
Right.
necessarily in comparison, but hey, this is where my strengths are, and I'm not good at that, and that type of thing. And so, for partners specifically with betrayal trauma, that area gets really dysregulated to find their truth again. Who am I in relation to all of what just happened?
Yeah. So that's a perfect place to kind of pivot and talk a little more in depth about how the experience of trauma impacts our brain, our nervous system's ability to do this connection work. You spoke to it a little bit there. Can you keep unfolding that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start just with the basic nervous system that when we're in, say, fight or flight, the couples that I work with, I talk to all of them about, when you're in that hypervigilant fight or flight state, that's really the state that you're going to hurt each other after betrayal trauma, because there's more of a heightened, now you both see each other as dangerous. Your brains are seeing each other as dangerous. It starts out, the partner, because in, say, disclosure, she's all of a sudden learned everything she doesn't know, and her brain doesn't even know how to conceptualize it. It doesn't have a concept for what she just learned. And so what the brain does is it responds by putting her in a hypervigilant state. And that's where all of the triggering comes in. And so her brain is protecting her, saying, hey, he's dangerous now. And potentially other things that I see and hear are going to come into that fold of being dangerous. And so my brain's going to trigger immediately with facial expressions, tones of voices, certain places, certain things. And then of course, when she's triggering and he's still trying to do some of his work, his brain begins to see her as a danger. So you're both seeing each other as a danger, right? And that's where some of this toxic communication can happen. And so when we're in a more regulated state, kind of in a place where our bodies feel safe as opposed to hypervigilant, then we can communicate much more effectively and without hurting each other. And so that's just on a nervous system level. In terms of in the brain, like I said, the right temporal lobe is the part that I was talking about with the triggering, with the facial expressions and the tones of voices. That area is for emotional comprehension. So it's to understand what's coming up. But if we have been dealing with incredible overwhelm, then our brain protects us and it idles that area. And then what happens is our emotions get suppressed or they explode out of us. And after betrayal trauma, our brain doesn't really know what to do, right? It's overwhelmed. It's beyond overwhelmed at that point. And so, yeah. And then there are other areas, depending on the amount of trauma. If there's childhood trauma, sometimes in certain clients, I'll see what's called lambda in the occipital lobe when their eyes are open, and that's a visual scanning. So their nervous system doesn't feel safe.
Right.
Pre-conscious, they're not doing it on purpose, but I can see that they're scanning the room. And then, like I mentioned, over the sensory motor strip, there's sometimes I see this more with sexual abuse, or I've noted it to be more so with sexual abuse. I don't know that there are any studies that say that, but just in my work. And there's that faster brainwave over the sensory motor strip, which gives you kind of a hypervigilance, creates an inner restlessness and then kind of an inner anxiety. So you're hypervigilant to whatever may occur. And then there's an area in the brain, kind of in the parietal lobe, more on the left side from what I've seen it, that underneath that is the periaqueductal gray. And the periaqueductal gray is our natural anesthetist. And so this is where more dissociative type of experiences occur. It's our natural anesthetist. So if we cut our finger really bad, then that area sends to our finger very quickly, something to calm it down, especially if it's severe, Well, it's the same thing with trauma. If it's really severe, then what happens is it can also emotionally anesthetize.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a fabulous overview of just trauma in general impacting the nervous system. As you've begun to do this brain-based work, specifically in the realm of betrayal trauma, I'm curious to know mean, you're APSATS trained and certified, so you learned about betrayal trauma from that angle. But now taking that and now looking at it, through the brain, which is the coolest thing of what, in my mind, of what you get to do. Like, you actually see physically, what's happening, in terms of
Yeah.
energy levels, all of that. What have you learned about betrayal trauma through this
It's,
brain-based work?
yeah. So some of my partners, because I do both the partner and the addict,
Sure.
I do both. But the partners, what I find is more often than the addicts, they have, will end up, especially if they've had trauma throughout their lives. So it's not just the betrayal trauma; it's trauma previous to that. They'll have what's called an exhausted brain, and that was coined by Dr. Ritter, who's a neurosurgeon in the Netherlands. And the exhausted brain, basically, the brain just doesn't have any energy; it's burnt out. There's
Mm,
nothing left in it, and so these clients are exhausted. They still function because
right.
the brain knows how to function from previously, right?
Right.
But
Right.
it's just harder. Life is just
Right.
hard because they don't have a
Yeah.
brain. Mhm.
Wow. Wow.
No.
And oh, go
Mhm.
ahead. Keep going, please.
Oh, I was just going to say that it can lead to, to struggles with autoimmunity, but also all kinds of other body struggles. So that's where the
Yeah.
medical aspect comes into the work that I do.
And that's a huge piece. I'm gonna veer for a little bit from the basics of what we talked about, but I know that you can handle it. I think that's huge because I'm learning so much. It's being impressed upon me, just that mind body connection. Could you say a little bit more about those autoimmune and some of the other health issues that you have seen pop up, um, in this work that
Yeah.
end up being connected to the trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. It's there's a bigger picture around it because it depends on, that environment that you grew up in.
Right.
And then we look at the genetic, your genetic, what are you susceptible to? And,
Hmm.
your biome in your body, how are you taking care of it, and are you taking care of it? So all of that's a part of it. But what happens with betrayal trauma, if there's been a long history of trauma, and the body is not being well taken care of because self-care isn't great, then what we find is there can be a lot of inflammatory struggles in the body. And I even see, like, I'll talk to clients and maybe they had tummy aches when they were little, and what was never caught was something like that they had some food allergies and they just lived with
Hmm.
it because only it's kind of starting to come to light, and all of this
Hmm.
information that we have. And so there's maybe an underlying medical issue, and that area becomes weaker, let's say, because there's always been an underlying medical issue there. And then with the constant flow of, say, cortisol going through the body, which is really supposed to be fight or flight, it's not supposed to be that we live that way.
Right.
That begins to make our body not as it doesn't it's not able to process things as well,
Right.
and that's where some of that lowered energy in the brain or inflammation in the brain happens. And then as time goes on, the cellular structure could get damaged, and we can move into autoimmunity and things like that, especially if there's a
Right.
susceptibility to it. And so partners are known to have a lot of mental and physical struggles.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. And
Yeah.
you mentioned also earlier that you don't just work with betrayed partners. You also work with addicted partners and those who have done the betraying. So, how about same sort of a question? Looking at it through this lens of this brain based work, what have you learned about addiction?
Yeah, there are certain phenotypes that are, you know, harder than other phenotypes. Like, there's a low voltage fast, and it's called a phenotype. It's in the brain. It means the brain is very low voltage, and it's very, very fast. And so, as a matter of fact, I also write some cues sometimes for a treatment center that works with substance abuse and things like that. So I kind of have that perspective too of addiction. And with the low voltage fast, it's in families. It's
Mm,
genetically, you can see it. It often comes with a thing called beta spindling, which is an
hmm.
overarousal.
Right.
And the body's constantly over aroused. And then you have with this particular phenotype, and then you have probably a parent that had this, and so there's an unstable family environment, and because of that, your self-worth begins to maybe go into the space of I'm less than, or kind of bounce back in
Right.
that, or if I'm better than I'm less than, and then we move into school. And then because the beta spindles, those children are not easy. Children with beta spindles are not easy children to parent. And they're not easy in the school system. And so they're getting into trouble often. They're not paying attention. They're blurting things out. So a lot of times they have a learning disability that goes with it. And so again, I'm less than, I'm better, right?
Yeah. Right.
And
Right.
then, as they go down that road and their body continues to be aroused, they need to, they find external ways to calm it. And that
Right.
would be addiction, whatever the addiction is.
Yeah.
So there's that. There's also the obsessive compulsive. That's a different type of phenotype. It's more of a singulate based phenotype.
Hmm.
And so, but I've also learned other things about the addicts. Like, for example, there's a good amount of them that have that had learning disabilities that were never
Right.
identified. And sometimes that can feed into the relationship between unknowingly the relationship between the partner and the addict. For example, if someone has an expressive learning disorder and they were never it was never diagnosed, and they can't express themselves to their partner, but their partner is getting more and more frustrated because they can't express themselves.
Right. Right.
Right. And so that's, that's one. And there are a lot of others. I had one that, where it's, they would forget things. And
Yeah.
so
Right.
she interpreted it that, he doesn't care. All of these types of things. Well, when I looked at the brain, really, it was, there's a potential early onset, some type of dementia, it's still being looked into and that type of thing. And so it was true. They really were forgetting. And so
Yeah.
that completely changed the relationship between those two.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, that wasn't intentional.
Yeah, and that's one of the most beautiful things in the time, I got to see your work a little more up close and personal. One of the most beautiful things I saw was that partners, very understandably, betrayed partners, they're just trying to make sense of what's happening, right? And they're doing the best they can with the data they can,
Mhm.
and taking their experience and coming up with a narrative about it, which is what we all do. But you're, with your ability to actually show them, no, there are these other data points, right, that were outside of your awareness, because no shade on you for not being able to look inside the brain, but right, with these additional data points, it just completely would reconstruct the narrative of what was going on.
Completely. I find that my couples end up with more compassion for each other. Now, sometimes I'll have a client like the addict will have over that sensory motor strip, their mirror neurons will be disconnected. And so
Mm,
really they at this point in their lives, they don't have the, the ability for understanding subtleties and social emotional communication, and very likely empathy. They might have a
mhm.
cognitive empathy where they can think about how you
Right.
might, but they can't feel it. And so, so sometimes that information is quite helpful, to say, hey, he can't do that right now. He can get there. We can work towards getting there. And it's good that we know he can't do it right now.
Right.
Um, and if he is willing to make that goal, set that
Yeah.
goal, yeah, then we can work towards that as a couple.
Yeah. That's awesome. Um, okay. I want us to go a little bit deeper. We could spend hours going through every single part of the brain and you just unfolding it. But in your presentation, there are three parts of the brain in particular that you highlighted. And I want to walk through those a little more intentionally, because I think understanding those specific three, like if they don't remember all the other parts, that you've named, I think these three would be so helpful. So the insula, and then we'll talk about the cingulate and the right temporal lobe. But let's start with the insula. So can you kind of
Yeah.
unpack that?
Yeah. I've mentioned the others too, but I haven't really mentioned the insula at this point. It's very, very important. When I see that insula is dysregulated in a client, it's a little bit deeper in the brain, and it's connected to the frontal lobe. It's connected to our areas of motivation. It's connected to our limbic system. It's connected to certain neurotransmitters, the release of certain neurotransmitters. So it's connected to a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of clients who have that dysregulation have tried all kinds of medication, all types of treatment, and nothing has completely worked for them. Part of the reason is because so many parts of the brain are involved, that you can't necessarily have one medication that's going to address all the areas that gets dysregulated when the insula gets dysregulated. And you can't have therapies that necessarily address all those areas. So what does the insula do? It has a lot of different functions, as you can tell, because it's connected to a lot of areas. But one really, really important thing that it does is it's our mind-body connection. And so it's in terms of understanding ourselves and understanding others, what's really important is we have to have a sense of what's happening inside of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the partner and the addict, this gets closed off
Right.
because the partner, perhaps had gut feelings all the way through, but then
Right.
is, suppress those gut feelings. And so it disconnects that mind-body connection. And so we have to reconnect it because that's where our wisdom is. That's where our
Yes.
intention is, right? And so we
Yes.
need to go back in and make those connections to our body and understand, okay, and sometimes this is for the addict. If my stomach is hurting, sometimes that's about shame. I find that
Mm-hmm.
there are
Mm-hmm.
quite a few addicts that's where that space of shame is for them.
Right.
And
Right.
then, and then there are other areas about, there's a lot of grief that happens in the chest, a lot of grief
Right.
and pain around disconnection,
Yeah.
in the relationship and things like that. And so, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. I just want to kind of connect what you're talking about, the brain science, with like some of the work that we do clinically
Mhm.
with partners and addicts and specifically you talking about that wisdom and that gut knowing, and that it's been disconnected, and we want to help them reconnect it. So I'm thinking what came up for me is like when we're helping a betrayed partner prepare for disclosure.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we always do is we want to help them craft questions about times in the past they didn't listen to their gut.
Oh, that's
That
funny.
time you were, on this specific trip, and you told me you had to work late, and, that it ran until, 12 p.m. and all that, right? Or 11 a.m., whatever, um, was that true? And to get the betraying partner on record, get that validated with a polygraph, because so often they're like, see, I knew my gut was telling me. And it's amazing to see how that little thing begins to help them reconnect what you're describing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so when that insula is dysregulated, what happens is our body can either hypo communicate. And so
Mm.
we're not connected at all. We're disconnected, or hyper, like we're
Yeah.
anxious and then our heart is beating and
Yeah.
then we think we're having a heart attack, right? So we
Yeah.
go to the hospital. And so, and that kind of can bounce between the two when it's
Right.
dysregulated. And really, so the reason the insula is important, one more step in this process, is the insula is that what's happening in our body that informs our emotions and our decisions,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so, yeah, and so if we're misinterpreting what that is, or we're not interpreting it, right, then
Mm-hmm.
it's going to interfere with how we're experiencing our emotions and also how we're making our decisions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Now the singulate, which you have talked about a little bit, you've mentioned it before, but let's really unpack that one.
Mhm. Okay, yes. The cingulate is about focus, how we focus our attention, especially that anterior cingulate. I looked at the first 10 couples that I worked with the betrayal, trauma, and sex addiction, and a huge percentage of both partner and addict have their anterior cingulate dysregulated. And so what is that? It's how we focus our attention. And so when we're doing well, when we're in the flow, when life feels good, it feels smooth, we can often, in our nervous system is calmer, we can consider more options and choices, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
there's a little bit of a space, a resting space. We do
Mm-hmm.
have a resting network called the default network that allows our brain to kind of rest for millisecond. So you're not aware of it, but it opens up and allows your brain to be able to look at the broader picture. And so sometimes clients, when their singulate is getting more regulated, they'll be like, yeah, I noticed that there were flowers on the road on my way to work and, or way in today. And, it's all those things that they were missing because they were in fight or flight. And so when you're in fight or flight, it's actually different for the addict and for the partner. For
Oh,
the
okay.
Yeah, for the partner, it's more about danger.
Mm.
Their focus is scanning for danger, right? And
Mhm.
so that's what they're going to settle on. And because the nervous system is hyper vigilant, what happens is that becomes their filter. So they're not looking for safety. They're not looking for the other possibilities. So it's going to be more of a narrow way of interpreting the world. Now the addict, in terms of their focus is really on that, whatever it is, the choice of their addiction. And so, so the anterior cingulate is going to help them with the insula. It's going to help them to figure out what that next step is that they need to take in order to bring about that addiction.
Wow.
Makes
Wow.
sense. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a little bit different. They can have the danger and the fight or flight also, certainly, but the actual focus while they're in the addiction is
Mm.
different than the partner.
Wow. Okay. One more. The right temporal lobe.
Yeah, the
Unpack
right
that one.
temporal. I alluded to that just a little bit. So the right temporal lobe has a connection to the amygdala, and that's a part of our visual stream where we identify what something is, not where. There's another stream for where, but this is for what.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
so if that becomes hypervigilant, what happens is that visual ventral stream becomes hypervigilant, and that's the what stream. And so what we'll see is that this particular client will again suppress emotion or explode out. They're not able to have recognize a sensation, an emotion, and then what do I do with it? They're not able to transfer it to that frontal lobe. And so they're not comprehending what's coming up inside of themselves. And that's what that right temporal lobe is for, emotional comprehension.
Mhm.
And so again, the brain is going to be hyper vigilant in its interpretation of facial expressions, tones of voices, even movements or things like that. It's going to
Right.
be hyper vigilant. And so it's going to err on the side of um, um, making sure that she's safe or he's
Right.
safe. Yeah.
Right. And so this is where we see that, betrayed partners who are so keyed into tones of voice, facial expression, that
Yes,
kind of thing, right? Like, and,
exactly.
and I've witnessed that here where I'm watching, I'm listening, I'm not picking up on anything that sounds critical or defensive, but the partner is
Mhm.
convinced, that that's what's
Yes.
happening. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you this later, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you now because you mentioned the visual stream. And that's
Yes.
another important piece of this. So how can the visual stream make errors, particularly with those clients who have PTSD?
Yeah. So I created a presentation recently about that visual stream because I actually had someone who had autistic tendencies, and
Mm,
my statement was they think differently. And so mom was like, what does that mean exactly? So I created a
yeah.
presentation. And so that visual stream is affected with autism, with ADHD, with PTSD, and can be affected with anxiety disorders also. So
Mm,
how is it specifically affected with PTSD? Again, there's that hypervigilance, and that hypervigilance creates a very narrow window in which interpretation
mhm,
comes from, as opposed to a
mhm.
wider space of possibilities.
Right.
And therefore, because that space is narrow and because the nervous system is tightened, it's more likely to make errors. And so it's more likely to call something dangerous, even potentially when it's not dangerous. So that's
Mm,
going to make errors in that direction. And
right.
so, the questions come to, okay, is this true? Is this true now, right, versus in the
Right.
past?
Right.
Uh, yeah, is it true for me now? And sifting through that is really challenging because
Yeah.
really have to calm that nervous system down, which we can do
Yeah.
here, like vagal stimulator and things like that. But you really have to calm that nervous system down so it's not so hyper vigilant. And then when it's not so hypervigilant, they can begin to expand the possibilities of what certain facial expressions, tones of voices, movements, and things like that what it may mean.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And thank you for taking the time to unpack those. My hope is that those listening to this will really be able to take it in. I'm thinking specifically for betraying partners or addicted partners, that this might help increase some understanding and empathy of what's going on for their betrayed partners, why they're experiencing what might feel to them like criticism, critique, judgment, not being accurately seen, or that negativity bias or whatever, just to understand this is a real thing happening in the brain, you know
Yeah.
yeah. And then
Yeah.
and yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and it is real for the partner, because you have to remember, when she walked into disclosure, she had no concept in her brain that knew how to handle that situation,
Sure.
and so the brain very quickly, in defense and protection of the partner, creates all kinds of protection in the brain, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so, and sometimes what I see when I work with partners over a long period of time is he has to get to the space where he can, carry some of that pain
Mhm.
and kind of put his pain over here, carry some of her pain. And she's got to be able to walk through, um, because her brain has taken all these things, and then there's all kinds of, fight or flight, defense,
Right.
protection,
Right.
explanations for them. And
Right.
sometimes they have to be unpacked one at a
Yes.
time, get all the way
Yeah.
through what,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Once you, yeah. Mhm.
yeah, and
I
that's
think the last thing I was
exactly.
going
Oh, good. No,
yeah.
go ahead.
Well,
Go
the
ahead.
last thing I was going to say is she feels safer as she's allowed to one by one unpack them and
Right.
see that there might be a bigger perspective around it.
Right. Well, okay, that's what I was going to say too. So we were headed in the exact same direction. Yeah, just I totally see how understanding this for the betraying or addicted partner so helpful to, maybe increase a basis for empathy, but for betrayed partners, like to be able to just, here's the science of why, you, when as you feel safe, can begin to open yourself, that
Mhm.
initial defensive, protective interpretation and response may not actually be taking into account, all the present incoming data, because of what's happened to your brain. And I just had a conversation with a betrayed partner a week or two ago, where she's just really struggling with that. Like, she wants to hold on, that her, because she had given up her gut instinct in the past, now it's like, no, I am not letting it go. Well, that's there's a balance there, right? Because when the brain is injured, we can't trust that entirely either.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to say there is a balance, because I've also had partners where, as a therapist, sometimes you might be thinking, hey, I wonder, if there's an error here, or if this is real. But we can't judge it ourselves as therapists. It really has to be sifted through by the
Right.
part. She's got to come to
Yes.
understand what that is. And there have been times where, as we continue on, I'm kind of like, wow, she was right. There was
Mm-hmm.
something else going on, and
Mm-hmm.
and and she was picking up on it. And
Right.
so it's such a balance between honoring and trying to really sift through, is the brain making errors, or is it not? Is it gut? Is it on? Is it, it's a
Yeah.
challenge,
Yes.
for
Yeah,
everybody involved, for the
for
addict, for the
sure.
partner, and sometimes for the therapist, as they're trying to honor the partner in terms of all of what's happening inside of her, and also help her to develop her new truth. What is my new
Right.
truth? Right?
Right.
Hmm.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. So, um, let's talk about empathy a bit more.
Yeah.
What
Okay.
might be happening when a betrayed partner is experiencing a lack of empathy from the betraying partner?
Yes. So there are several things. So there are plenty, of course, there's lots and lots of ADHD involved with addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And that phenotype I talked about earlier, the low
Mm-hmm.
voltage fast or the beta spindles, that's like a straight pathway to addiction. I think it's probably the phenotype that turns into addiction the most often. So if you have that one, as a child, you're at a much higher risk for addiction at that. And so now in terms of empathy, I believe it's about 25% of kids with ADHD also have what's called mu over their sensory motor strip. And mu is on the right side, it's a social emotional disconnect. And on the left side, it's more linguistic. And so on the right side, they may be in groups and some people are like, oh, I'm great. I understand. But really, if we dig down into it, they've learned to cope and they've probably learned to either mentalize or to cognitively understand. But they really miss the subtleties. And at some points in their life, they felt outside. They didn't feel that,
Mm-hmm.
that they had that same connection as everybody else
Right.
did in the group. And that's on the social emotional. On the linguistic side, it could be, just subtle forms of communication are lost for absurdity
Yeah.
or things like that. And so with that, again, if she wants him to understand subtleties, he's going to miss a lot of cues
Mm-hmm.
for her and for people in general. So she can probably notice, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
he misses cues out here too, and just in the general population.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very difficult to have empathy if you can't pick up social cues, right? And so that's one
Right.
level. Sometimes that can get thrown off in developmental trauma also. And then there's the right temporal lobe, again, has to do with, we have to understand what emotions are coming up inside of us. And we need to be able to kind of shift it to that frontal lobe in order for us also to be able to understand what's happening in someone else. And so if we're dysregulated in that emotional area, we may also be dysregulated in the frontal areas that bring up intention. What is this person's
Mm-hmm.
intentions? I may misinterpret intentions also.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's, again, it's challenging sifting through. But the great thing is working on the brain, and calming the nervous system, it shifts a person. And so then we can begin to recognize a little bit more of what the truth is for this particular person because their nervous system is settling down. The areas of the brain that are dysregulated are becoming better regulated. And so they're able to
Right.
get in touch with that truth about themselves and over time make less errors.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I love that again because I just think having the science of it can help almost like depersonalize it for a lot of partners. I've seen that happen and partners that
Mhm.
you've worked with specifically.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, it's not just me.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
not just because he doesn't want to or, something with me. And so helpful. Also from your presentation though, you talked about how betrayal trauma could affect the betrayed partner's capacity for empathy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, okay. So after disclosure, when her world, she has no schema for that,
Mm-hmm.
for what just
Right.
happened in her brain. She doesn't have a framework for it. That right temporal lobe gets really dysregulated, and that we call that the PTSD. It's a PTSD marker when
Mm-hmm.
we see it really dysregulated. And so she's going to have very no empathy for her spouse, really, right? Because he is now a danger. And so that empathy is going to take quite a while to get restored, if ever. Sometimes it takes years and years, and sometimes it doesn't, depending on if he can help her to feel safe, you
Right.
know, then the possibility is much more stronger there. If we can get her nervous system to feel safe and he can help her to feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. And so, but there are other things too. If she's hypervigilant, say she had trauma prior um, to getting married, then her nervous system is going to be more elevated, and it's really, really hard to connect in meaningful emotionally vulnerable ways when our nervous system is dysregulated like that. And we can connect what feels like vulnerable ways, right? But often it's like we're going too deep too quick, right?
Right.
And so we're not, kind of building a relationship on slowly bringing up vulnerabilities and see how they're received. And so it can be dysfunctional, even if it feels like that you're mm, putting your vulnerabilities out there, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And now, because I know we're coming up on the edge of our time, but I want to make sure we get this in. The incredible work you've been doing with couples. So not just working with them individually, but working with the two people, working with two brains as a
Mhm.
couple, as a dyad, as a unit. Can you talk about like your process that you've been developing and working with couples from this brain-based place, and then and the results that you've been seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. What I do, of course, I do the cues for both of them, and then we have a session where we review the cues, and it really because it's objective and because I am not there's not judgment from me or anything in my
Yeah.
office because it's really your brain, and it is how your brain has handled life, and it's the ways that your brain has protected you,
Yeah.
right? And so then we begin treatment, and a lot of my treatment focuses on, because a lot of times when they come from Daring Ventures, they've had a lot of they can think through, especially the addicts.
Right.
They can think through. But what I find is if their nervous system has been really dysregulated and they have developmental trauma, that I really focus on the body and the emotions.
Mm-hmm.
I want to
Yeah.
understand what's happening in that body, because I find that the body is more truthful
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
times
Absolutely.
than it's hard. And
Right.
so, yeah. And so
Yeah.
I connect them with that aspect. So we go into how does that feel in your body? And then as he's seeing her and she's seeing him in terms of how that's affecting them in their body, this truth comes out that is very different than than would have come out with just the thoughts. Does that make sense? And
Mm-hmm.
they're able to honor it on a different level because there's a little bit more of a vulnerability in terms of going into what's actually happening in your body
Yeah.
around.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I want to break that down a little bit to make sure we don't. I want people to really understand. You said you start with cues. I don't want
Yes.
some people may not even know what that means.
Oh
So
yeah.
so
Yeah.
so you
Mhm.
start
Mhm.
with basically like this very thorough assessment of the brain, its parts, its individual parts, but also even the functioning among the parts, and you
Mhm.
produce this remarkable, I've seen many of them at this point, this remarkable report
Mhm.
is very high resolution look at the brain and what it is and is not doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I tend to work on the report until I know that I have an answer for why they're here. And most of my clients are here because nothing else has really worked, right?
Mm,
And so what I find is that sometimes, there's always, the parts of the brain, but sometimes I can't even necessarily see what's going on in the brain because, say, the voltage is so low or there's so much inflammation, that type of thing. And so that's where the medical aspects come in. So, and that's what I do now is I also really combine, there's the therapeutic aspects that are really important because you've got to do that. And then there's the medical aspect that you may continue to be in that fight or flight, even though you do a lot of therapy, if there's
right,
something medical that's creating that, right?
right.
Uh, and I've been just amazed at some of what I've found. I collaborate with a lot of different individuals who do the work that I do, but they are in different fields, and so it creates a wider view for me. And I've been just unbelievably amazed sometimes at
Mm,
what all of us, in terms of come up with together when we're looking at an EEG and we're looking at maybe some lab work and things like that, that can be impactful and make a huge difference for the client.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'll just speak personally. So when you and I first started working together, you did a
mhm,
QEEG on me, and so as someone who's you know gone through that and then had you present kind of what you saw, it was amazing in terms of its validation, the validation I felt of my own experience. You talked about, I had always suspected that I had an undiagnosed learning disorder. You named that, and I remember feeling really vulnerable because like I have no idea what this is going to show, and I'm in recovery, and what's she going to see, what's she going to think about me? And you said, I can tell you've worked really hard on your recovery. It just felt so good. But then when you unpack that and explain what you saw, it was so amazing. I thought, oh my gosh, I want everybody to get to experience this. So it's remarkable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's just like,
Yeah.
it's an honor for me to be able to be that,
Yeah.
have that part.
Yeah. Well, so what are, you talked a lot of science, which is awesome.
Mhm.
What are some practical takeaways? If you could give a top 2 or 3 practical takeaways, tips, tools for those
Yeah.
listening.
Yeah. The biggest thing that I find with my couples that is helpful to them, uh, one is that I'm really, really calming their nervous system to a space where um, they're not living in the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight, that we
Hmm.
can actually move them into that parasympathetic nervous system where they feel safe.
Yeah.
And when they begin to feel safe with each other, it's amazing the changes that can begin to
Right.
come. There has to be therapy that goes along with that in terms of helping them develop the skills around it too. So we can work on the brain to create that, but we have to have the skills and the medical if that's needed. And so I say it's holistic in a sense. We
Hmm.
can't ignore our bodies. We've got to really
Hmm.
address what's happening with our bodies. And if you wake up every morning and you have a hard time getting out of bed, or you have to stay hypervigilant all day long, then there's probably, some medical underlying things that might be going on. A lot of my clients have sleep struggles that really interfere, and then their nervous system can't calm down if they are not getting quality sleep, say deep sleep. And
Hmm.
so, and pain, like if we're feeling physical pain, a lot of that is the same network as the fight or flight network. And so
Hmm.
it's really hard to calm our nervous systems down if they're in physical pain. And
Yeah.
so for me, I guess it's like addressing the whole thing. But the biggest thing for me, I think, is helping them shift to that space where they can feel safe with each other again. And then they can
Yes.
begin to do some work. Um,
Yes. Yeah. And again, I just want to kind of give testimony to that. In fact, just recently, and I'll do this without giving away any client health information, but you and I shared a couple for 2 weeks where they saw you pretty much every day. They saw me 3 days a week for half a day. And I watched what happened as their nervous systems were able to calm and go into that safe space, and then them come into my office to do some really deep, amazing healing work together. It was beautiful,
yeah.
absolutely beautiful.
That's the most awesome thing. And that's the other thing is, like, when I looked at the 10 couples that I did,
Hmm.
and now I need to add in some additional couples to that. But I did some follow-ups with them. And what I
Hmm.
found is that the clients with the addictions tended not to, their baseline came down in terms of their nervous system reactivity. So they didn't
Yeah.
react as much, or they were not as defensive and things like that. And with her, her level of safety kind of um, it increases a bit. And what we do, partially what we do is we say this is a felt sense of what it feels like to feel safe.
Right.
And now you know it, you've got it inside of you. And so when you experience this and who you experience this with, it's safe, right? And
Yeah.
so friendships or whatever. And then there'll be times still with the partner where something will come up that maybe it doesn't feel safe, but maybe it's from the past and not the present, right?
Right.
And maybe he's actually changed in the present, but there's still a fear in that nervous system about the past. And then we kind of sift through that to figure
Hmm.
out, is it the past or is it the present, right?
Right. Right.
Where do you need to put that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
So
That's
yeah.
so good. So good. Well, Laura, where can people find you? How can they contact you if they want to work with you?
Yeah. So I'm in Houston, and right down the street from Daring Ventures, very close.
Yeah.
My email address is Laura, Laura, at neurohouston, neurohouston.com. And so that's probably the best way to make a first introduction. In that, I'm in session a lot. And
Yeah.
so, yeah,
Right.
hard to catch me.
Right.
Although I do have an admin, and she is, and that's admin, ADMIN, at neurohouston.com. Her name's Rebecca, and she's pretty incredible about making sure that my details are covered.
That's good. We
And
need those
so
admins.
it will be those admins, yes.
Yeah.
And so those are probably the quickest and the easiest ways to get in touch with us, and then we'll follow up pretty quickly with each.
Excellent. Well, Laura, I want to say thank you, not just for the beautiful work you do, but you're a huge supporter of the APSATS community as well. And you've given presentations and offered your expertise and your knowledge so often to the wider APSATS community of professionals, which I know has a ripple effect to so many clients in need. So thank you for doing
But
that.
I have to say I'm working on, and I'm going to roll it out really probably within the next month, but I want to do a once a month for APSATS, that, but not through APSATS, probably more just through
Sure.
me, but basically call it something like Brainy Bits, or,
Nice. I love it.
yeah, and really, really help, clinicians and coaches understand what could potentially be going on in the brain. And I've had
Yeah.
some people ask me to do that. So now I'm getting it all together so that I can once a month kind of present something that'll help people to really understand a little bit more clearly the objective aspects of what betrayal trauma is.
Excellent.
What
Well,
sex-
thank you. It's
Yeah.
much needed. So thank you. Well, thank you so much. And I know that this has been a great gift to all those listening, and I'm sure we'll have you back again another day.
Yeah. Thank you, Jake.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Betrayal Recovery Radio, hosted by Dr. Jake Porter. If you value the content we've shared today, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. This helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. For more resources, visit APSATS.org. That's APSATS.org.